Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Inmate Alliance's presentation of the Insider. Now, for those of you who don't know, this is a broadcast to tell you the truth about what's really going on with the Federal Bureau of Prisons, because there's seldom, if anything, in the news that would tell you that anything is wrong. So without further ado, let me get into it. My handle is the old guy, and been there, done that, kids. So listen up. I think there's some valuable information for some of you that listen to me regularly. The Supreme Court has issued its February oral argument schedule, including 2 cases of substantial interest to federal defendants and prisoners. And 2 arguments actually fall the first week of March. But then this is the Supreme Court, where this is still the October 2025 term. So nonetheless, there's some very important stuff going on. First, the one not getting much press, but arguably the more important of the 2 cases that we need to pay attention to is Hunter versus the United States, a case that asks whether a federal appeals court properly dismissed a Texas man's appeal of a mandatory medication condition when he had just waived his right to appeal as part of his plea agreement. So a lot of you, I know from personal experience, took plea deals, in which when you do that, you give up your right to appeal. So, this is pretty heady stuff here. Something like 94% of federal cases end in guilty pleas. I think it's higher than that. I bet you it's closer to 95, 96, 97% from what I understand about these things. And virtually all of those pleas were entered pursuant to a written plea agreement between the defendant and the government. And virtually all those agreements have the defendant are agreeing to waive his or her right to appeal, to file post-conviction attacks on their conviction and sentences, and to give up other rights, such as the right to seek compassionate release or even bring a freedom of information request for records from the government. Now, the Hunter issue before the Supreme Court include what, if any, are the permissible exceptions to waiver in a plea agreement, now generally recognized as only being claims of ineffective assistance of counsel or that the sentence exceeds the statutory minimum. And I think that is critically important, especially when you have a federal public defender or limited resources, as so many of us in those circumstances, that ineffective counsel is an incredibly difficult thing to pursue. I was told by a friend of mine who is a very experienced attorney that even if your counsel had been drunk through the entire process, you probably do not have a claim for ineffective counsel. That's just, isn't that awful? That just sticks in my craw. At any rate, a second issue is whether an appeal waiver applies when the sentencing judge advises the defendant that he or she has the right to appeal and the government does not object. I mean, this is kind of like talking out of both sides of your mouth, The Supreme Court's case getting more attention is the United States versus Hamani, in which the government is challenging a Fifth Circuit ruling that prohibits an unlawful user of a controlled substance from possessing a gun, which violates the Second Amendment as applied to the defendant. Mr. Hamani was a regular marijuana user, but was not high while in physical possession of his handgun. And I think this applies to a lot of other guys who sometimes listen to this broadcast. And I know there were some people who were sent back to prison because they were in possession of a weapon, not doing anything wrong, not doing anything, just there was a weapon on the premises, and they got sent back. Law professor Joel Johnson, a former Supreme Court litigator with the Department of Justice, recently argued in a SCOTUS blog post that the Supreme Court could easily dispose of the Himani case by relying on the rule of lenity instead of the Second Amendment. I have no idea what that is, but we're going to find out. If the court decides that the law applies only to people who are armed while intoxicated, the Second Amendment concerns largely vanish. There is stronger historical support for disarming someone who is high and thus not of sound mind than there is for disarming someone who happened to smoke a joint last weekend but is no longer impaired. Also, in a SCOTUS blog post, New York University law professor Daniel Harawa argued for a revival of the rule of lenity. Congress has enacted, this is the professor speaking, Congress has enacted thousands of criminal laws, many written broadly and enforced aggressively. I like that. Written broadly and enforced aggressively. That's kind of like conspiracy, you know. It's the definition of conspiracy is so broad that it can just sweep up almost anybody. With an overly bloated criminal code, lenity should function as a meaningful check, a reminder that punishment must rest on clear legislative authorization. Excuse me, I keep turning the microphone off because I'm coughing here. So, the rule of lenity is about who bears the risk of uncertainty in the criminal law. For most of the court's history, that risk fell on the government. I think that's important. When Congress failed to speak clearly, defendants were entitled to the benefit of the doubt. If it wanted, Congress could rewrite the law to clarify its reach, but it doesn't. There's no cause for congressional imprecision, however, and thus no real need for Congress to legislate carefully and clearly. When lenity is weakened, the cost of ambiguity switches from the government to the defendants, and the result is more defendants. Given the pedigree and the importance of this rule, the Supreme Court needs to resolve when the rule applies sooner rather than later. And I think this is important for all of us. I think too many of us got swept up in this system through no fault of our own, and that federal prosecutors use the ambiguity in law to come after us, you know, so that they can pad their statistics for convictions. Second Amendment advocates and scholars hope that Himani will advance the Second Amendment debate begun by Heller, Bruin, and Romani. But even if it does not, it may provide some enduring guidance on the rule of lenity, an issue of less sexiness but perhaps more important to criminal law. 2 weeks ago, the Federal Bureau of Prisons printed its annual. I think this next part is outstanding, and this kind of brings this whole prison thing into perspective. And I'm meaning no disrespect to Director Mitchell, who is, I think, working like a dog to get some stuff done, but he's meeting with obstruction around every corner. So the Bureau of Prisons printed the annual cost of incarceration fee in the Federal Register. This annual ritual reports on how much it costs the BOP using whatever voodoo accounting the government may command that can figure for costs within the facilities to lock someone up for a year. The number assumes that keeping someone in the FCI Florence Supermax, the Federal Correction Institute Florence, that's in Kentucky, the Supermax, costs the same as keeping a prisoner at a camp, which is ridiculous, but imperfect data is probably better than no data at all. I would hazard to guess that the number of COs per inmate at a Supermax far exceeds the number of COs who would be in a camp. So where you have maybe one or two COs for 150, 200 prisoners, and you have to bring someone generally over from a low to assist with counts, as opposed to a supermax where you've got to have, you got to have a lot more, because those are really bad dudes in a supermax. So again, some data is better than none, but maybe not so much. The BOP reported that based on fiscal year 2024 data, the average annual cost to incarcerate a federal prisoner housed in a bureau or non-bureau facility was $47,162, about $130 a day. The average annual cost for a federal inmate housed in a residential reentry center, or halfway house, was $43,703. Not appreciably different, because it's still a heavily supervised situation. Drug testing, in and out, those kinds of things. And this is based on the fact that there were 366 days in fiscal year 2024. So it's a leap year. But it never accounts for the cost of home confinement. The best number available is from the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. Home confinement supervision costs about $4,700 a year, about $13 a day in fiscal year 2024. So it is in the best interest of the Bureau of Prisons, Federal Bureau of Prisons, to seek out opportunities to place inmates on home confinement, supervised home confinement, as opposed to a halfway house or keeping them incarcerated. It just makes fiscal sense. And when you are on supervised release or home confinement, it takes a whole lot less supervision, because that little ankle monitor that you're wearing tracks your every move. And it's not for just anyone. It generally is for minimum to low risk prisoners who are judged or deemed to be eligible for home confinement. So it's in the Bureau's best interest to get as many people in home confinement, and they just don't see the forest through the trees. Some stuff makes common sense. As I've spoken about many times in this program, there are about 8,000 veterans in the federal prison system. Those guys should be at the VA, where they can get the rehabilitative services, both mental and physical, that they need to get back into society. Spending time at a federal correction facility where there is little or no mental health opportunities and very poor medical care, these guys are suffering, and they're suffering greatly, and they need to be in the proper place. There are approximately 20,000 non-U.S. citizens in federal prisons. Most of those need to be sent back to their home state or their home countries. They don't belong here. And why should the government spend almost over $47,000 to house those guys? It doesn't make any sense. It just puts a significant burden on the resources of the BOP. And the third issue is to get the guys who are eligible for release through their First Step Act or Second Chance Act credits, to get them out. If they're, depending on their circumstances, a lot of them can be placed on home confinement. You can go to work, you can come back, you can't vary your route, you need permission to do whatever you need to do. And $4,700 is a lot cheaper than $43,000, almost $44,000 to put them in a halfway house. So it makes economic sense to do the things that need to be done to get the right prisoners out of this system. And in a place where they can continue their rehabilitation, but they can do it in a far more cost-effective situation. I've often drawn attention to the seeming fascination that the DOJ has in past administration of both political parties, while forcefully using the full power of the federal prosecutors to punish enemies and reward friends. The administration has shown little interest in pursuing white-collar cases, preferring instead focus on violent crime. That'd be nice, as more facts regarding the incestuous relationship between major industries like the pharmaceutical industry and banking interest, many members of Congress, and the federal prosecution, industrial complex, and job creation complex come to light, the spotlight shifts to the many nonviolent individuals who currently languish in federal prisons. The president has showed special interest in many of these cases and pardoned individuals that he feels were unfairly targeted by these powerful interests. There are many more that deserve relief. I know a lot of guys who should receive pardons because we were just set up, because we were naive. We believed something that someone told us, and they set us down a merry path, and they used this conspiracy thing to get easy convictions, and we end up in prison because basically, guys, we were stupid. I believed so and so when he told me, or I didn't think I was doing anything wrong, or I was led down a path by somebody who was stealing and covering his tracks and using me as a scapegoat. So it's to keep those things in mind. I mean, I don't know that there's anything we can do about it, but we can help pave the way for those coming behind us, so that perhaps that doesn't continue to happen. Unfortunately, time and space limitations do not permit complete treatment of this issue, but the federal justice system has often been used as a tool by prosecutors all too willing to wage highly publicized prosecutions on individuals who run afoul of powerful political and financial interests. Yeah, you're on the receiving end of this kind of stuff, and you don't even see it coming because you didn't think you were doing anything wrong. You didn't think the person you were reporting to was doing anything wrong. So federal prosecutors interested in moving up the political ladder, whose only qualification was doing the business of powerful business interests and potential future campaign contributors. And there are no shortage of judges who also obtain their appointments based upon their connections to either the banking, finance, or pharmaceutical industries. And there are some very specific judges around the country that should be looked at. How can prosecutors and judges, who are in cahoots, by the way, they get paid by the same people, and defense lawyers, they're like a good old boys club. They know each other and they glad hand each other, and I don't know how those people can look at you with a straight face and tell there's no collusion between the three. The question is, how do prosecutors and judges win back some of that trust that they lost from a skeptical public? Perhaps by turning again to the long-standing concepts of lenity. There comes that word again. Lenity, or the rule of lenity, is a long-standing legal principle in criminal law that requires courts to interpret an ambiguous or unclear criminal statute in a way that is most favorable to the defendant. It's like when you file a pro se motion, you are assumed to be getting preferable treatment because you're representing yourself and you're not an attorney. But that doesn't always seem to be the case. So, I think the imposition of this in a more favorable light would be significant in helping those of us who have been on the receiving end of some of this stuff. This rule essentially means that any unresolved doubt in a penal law's meaning must be resolved against the state and in favor of the accused. It's like this. In my particular case, I know that the prosecutor lied repeatedly in closing arguments. And he should have been sanctioned. He should have been fined. He should have been found in contempt of court for doing that. Nope, not the case. I guess it's okay when you're a prosecutor that you can do those kinds of things, and there's kind of no skin off their nose, and the judge just kind of goes along with it. And, well, if you wanted a new trial, you only had 2 weeks to do it. Well, it took 7 months to get the transcript to find what had happened. So it's a little tough to request in 2 weeks when it took 7 months to get a transcript in the middle of the pandemic. So this rule of lenity, or lenity, I don't know how you pronounce that. We'll assume it's lenity, would have come in particularly handy, at least in my case. And now the Federal Bureau of Prisons, despite recent reforms and changes at the top, yes, Director Mitchell, you are trying to do a fabulous job, and you care and you're committed. But it continues to fall short of fulfilling its mission of humane incarceration and meaningful rehabilitation. Resistance by staff to new initiatives and central office directives, rampant waste, continued mismanagement of government programs, and outright criminal behavior continue to bedevil the new director's important initiatives. And I think that is absolutely a shame. One thing I've said before, I think you ought to can them all. Make them reapply for their jobs, make them go through a psychological profile screening and renewed training. And while you're doing that, have National Guard come in and operate the prisons under specific guidelines until you can get these guys vetted and retrained and put back in place, and we'll give you an opportunity, now that the union's been decertified, we'll give you the opportunity to get rid of the bad apples, I mean, it's the perfect opportunity to do it. Plus, they're stymieing the director at every turn. So it's like, this is an awful situation going on. There have been some bright spots. First Step Back, Second Chance Act. It's hard to overestimate the long-term positive impact of Director Marshall's June 17th memo to fully implement First Step Back and Second Chance Act. That directive to staff ordered that FSA and SCA sentence reduction benefits should be stacked, and conditional placement dates should drive timely referrals, not bureaucratic inertia. Apparently some of the counselors and other staff didn't get that message, but it is clearly the directive of the director to get on it and do these things. But we're still getting reports that so many facilities, the counselors just could care less. The director even appointed a trusted deputy and empowered him to oversee the process. Although improvements in the process have occurred, these reforms have only begun to take hold, and litigation has still sometimes is needed to unlock these credits, especially for legal non-citizens. So the government gets an incomplete grade. Another bright spot, staff reorganization. Although a lot of this has gone on under the radar, virtually all regional directors have been or are being replaced. Hear, they're idiots. I can't tell you how many times I got bad information from the regional office because they assumed something rather than pertaining to the law. And it just, you look up things and you file administrative remedies, and they don't care. They just don't care. President Trump's executive order stripping the formerly all-powered Correctional Workers Union of collective bargaining power that became reform-blocking vetoes of any positive reforms now gives regions the power to do its job, if they choose to do so. However, many more positions remain to be upgraded. So we're trying, they're trying, but not nearly where they need to be. And the final bright side is culture change. Previous BOP leadership merely tolerated incompetence and laziness. Pervasive culture change will be incremental. It's going to take a long time to get these clowns to do what they're supposed to do. The previous culture made possible the cover-up of rampant criminality, including the FCI Dublin Rape Club, of which a number of staff have gone to prison. The discouragement of PREA reporting and investigations, and the disregard of fraud at virtually every institution, especially in the areas of contracting, maintenance, food service, purchasing, and commissary operations. They're thieves. The new administration's more aggressive, results-driven leadership has encouraged reporting the worst abuses. In the absence of union obstacles to staff discipline or dismissal will accelerate the pace of reform. You got to give it time, but these guys are so entrenched in this and so used to putting it to people that it's going to take a while. And it's going to be trickled down from the director to the regions to the individual prisons. And that includes getting rid of incompetent, incapable wardens and their deputies who are just the epitome of the Peter Principle, being promoted to the level of their incompetence. It's just amazing. We used to sit around and just shake our heads at the idiotic things they do, and hence the original the original name of this show was Backwards on Purpose, and that was the term that inmates use because the decisions that administration makes are absolutely unbelievably stupid. So, but the one thing I got to mention, the worst of the not so bright spots is medical care, which is absolutely awful. It is hard to overstate. Trust me, it's hard to overstate the magnitude of human misery and death caused by decades of incompetent BOP medical competence and accountability. Current leadership will also fail in reversing this national scandal if major changes occurred. Congress helped cause this mess by largely depriving prisoners of legal remedies to redress all the most egregious personal injuries and death cases caused by the Bureau incompetence. And the BOP has built a policy that relies on that misguided policy to shield them from any real consequences. Now, I don't have the case name at my fingertips right now, but there is a case working through the Supreme Court that's waiting a decision is, can you file a medical malpractice claim against the medical people that work at these prisons? I think that would be a very, very important one to pay attention to, right, Scott? They try to kill you through negligence, through incompetence, through changing drugs, through delaying treatment. It's awful. And we're not prisoners of war. We're federal prisoners and deserve better than what's been going on. Excuse me. Well, I didn't get through all my topics today, but most of them. And I want to applaud Director Mitchell, who is trying his level best to replace these regional guys, to replace the bureaucracy and the hierarchy of the federal prison system with something that is accountable to the people and is in keeping with their mission, which is to incarcerate and rehabilitate. So with that, I'm going to sign off for the day, and hopefully, I got my fingers crossed that I successfully recorded this broadcast so I can put it up on my website, which is www.inmatealliance.org. And my appreciation to the station originating this broadcast, which is WBGU 88.1 FM on the campus of Bowling Green State University. So thank you again. See you in a couple weeks, and bear with me while I hopefully push all the right buttons. See you again.